Well, good evening and happy International Women's Day. Welcome to the fifth program of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan's 2021 8-week Great Decisions series, with topics suggested by the Foreign Policy Association of America. I'm Michael Vendetten, the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council, and on behalf of my colleague, Erica Kubik, and the Board of Directors of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan, I welcome all of you. Thank you for adjusting with us as we program responsibly in this time of the COVID-19 pandemic. We hope that you will stay safe and show grace to those in your community. The Council's mission is to empower the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world. We do this with the support of over 50 local companies, 11 colleges and universities, and many community members. Together, we seek to provide programming that is credible, objective, relevant, civil, and compelling. To change the world, we believe, one must first know the world. Tonight, we say thank you to Wolverine Worldwide as our series sponsor, to Blue Lake Radio and the Community Media Center as media sponsors, and a special message of gratitude to longstanding council advocate Vernice Shad, whose generosity has provided funds to welcome Julia as the 2021 Vernice Shad Lectureship for Women in Global Studies presenter. Thank you, Vernice, very much for your longtime support and encouragement. After Ms. Luscombe's presentation this evening, there will be ample time for questions. You can type them into the YouTube comments section, or you can text them to 616-308-6560. Please exhibit civility to our guest and hospitality to others by asking respectful and succinct questions. We are very pleased to welcome Julia Luscombe, and we are grateful to her for her flexibility to engage us in this format. Julia Luscombe is the Managing Director of Strategic Planning for Feeding America, a nonprofit working to end hunger in the United States through a nationwide network of food banks and partners. She facilitates the development of strategies to advance equitable results for people facing hunger, and she creates systems to drive organizational effectiveness and to measure impact. Luscombe is also a member of the Global Shapers community of the World Economic Forum, and she co-chaired the World Economic Forum's annual meeting in 2019. She received her BA and BSc from the Huntsman Program in International Studies and Business at the University of Pennsylvania, and her MS in Local Economic Development from the London School of Economics. She was a Fulbright grantee to Ecuador and formerly a strategy consultant at Monitor Deloitte. She focused on customer strategy, innovation, and organizational transformation. Bringing global insight and now working locally on the pressing issue of food security in the United States, Julia is passionate about understanding how globalization is contributing to inequities and identifying solutions to achieve more equitable and sustainable regional and local development as globalization continues. Her presentation tonight is titled Sustainable Globalization Post-COVID-19. We welcome Julia Luscombe, and Julia, welcome to this gathering of West Michiganders.
Great, thank you, Michael, and thank you for that generous introduction. It's great to be here. Thank you so much to the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan for having me, and I hope everyone out there is staying healthy and safe, and a very happy International Women's Day to all the women out there. And as Michael described, I'm really excited to be here today to reflect on globalization. Where have we been? What have we learned during COVID? And where globalization might be headed in a post-COVID world. In my work with Feeding America in the US food system, I'm really seeing firsthand the consequences of past waves of globalization playing out. And I'm excited to explore ways we can make the future of globalization and the next wave more equitable and sustainable. Like all the topics in these series, I'm sure this is a complex, multidimensional topic. So I'll do my best to at least get the conversation started in our allotted time. So I wanted to start by first setting the context on what we mean by globalization and its history. Globalization is the result of interconnectedness and interdependence between people and countries. It really kicked off with the expansion of the global economy after World War II, accelerated with the gradual opening of China in the 1970s, and then the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And then globalization was really catapulted with technology advances and the internet post 2000. And globalization has had a number of benefits: expanded markets for local products and increased economic activity have arguably lifted millions out of poverty and raised standards of living worldwide. Increased sharing of knowledge, more dissemination of technology and best practices across sectors has allowed innovations to more quickly be adopted around the world. And globalization has resulted in the spread of value systems and the convergence of global cultural models. So while the convergence of cultures can be problematic, arguably globalization has resulted in convergence of standards related to human rights, and although we have more work to do, improved equality for women and minorities. And more broadly, that global interconnectedness has enabled by globalization has allowed for more awareness and corrective action around issues that conflict with this increasingly global value system. So globalization has had some benefits, but it's also had major consequences. The benefits of globalization have not been distributed equally. Thomas Friedman notably said, "The world is flat," and that globalization had resulted in a level playing field and the death of distance. When in reality, we know that wealth and economic activity coming out of globalization has been focused in certain places and among certain people, notably in urban areas, in more developed countries, and among white people. So we continue to live in a very unequal, uneven world. According to a 2020 Oxfam report, the combined wealth of the world's 22 richest men is more than the wealth of all women in Africa. And according to the World Bank, half the world's population lives on less than $5.50 a day. There's also growing inequality within countries. The United States and United Kingdom are among the top 10 countries in terms of income inequality based on the Gini coefficient. So the disparities in wealth and economic success exist even among the so-called winners of past waves of globalization. And in the US, despite being the wealthiest country in the world, over 37 million people are food insecure. That was before COVID. And with COVID, we're projecting that as many as 50 million people could be food insecure over the next year. And that masks the inequities here in our own country. Native Americans are 2.9 times more likely to live in food insecure households compared to whites. Blacks are 2.4 times more likely, and Latinos are 2 times more likely to live in food insecure households. Rural communities broadly, where so much of our food is produced, it's so mind-boggling, those rural communities can have food insecurity rates as high as 30%. In some of the Native American communities we serve, there is a lack of basic infrastructure, so charitable food is actually delivered by helicopter. So the world is not flat. The results of past waves of globalization have, in fact, been very uneven. Growth in GDP has not resulted in investment in all communities or in well-being for all people. Climate change is also a consequence of globalization. The processes that have underpinned economic growth and the growth of international markets and production systems, including putting fossil fuels towards urbanization, transportation, deforestation, have dramatically increased carbon dioxide emissions. Surface temperatures in each of the last 3 decades have been successfully warmer than any preceding decade since 1850. And scientists expect global mean surface temperatures will continue to increase. And how that extra warmth is distributed across the world is compounding the problem. 90% of the excess heat generated is going to oceans, and the rate of global warming is faster around the Arctic. Both of these factors are contributing to scrambled weather patterns and more intense storms. And we're seeing this playing out right now with the growing intensity of hurricanes and the recent extreme cold weather in Texas. I'm really hopeful these recent events, as well as the wildfires in California, are helping people to see that climate change is a present danger and not a future issue. Food production and food waste is also a major contributor to climate change. About 21 to 30% of total greenhouse gas emissions are attributable to the food system. And meat production, specifically cattle, contributes to greenhouse gas emissions at a rate 10 times higher than production of plants. And despite the high rates of food insecurity in the US that I described earlier, 40% of the food we produce here in the US is going to waste, and that decomposing food waste emits methane. So we have to get that in the hands of folks who need it. And climate change is in turn having an impact on food security. Changes to the environment are increasing the risk of pests and disease, reducing levels of crop production. High carbon dioxide concentrations reduce the levels of key nutrients like zinc and calcium in crops, and are ultimately reducing the nutritional quality of food. Those changing weather patterns I mentioned are having immediate impacts. Big precipitation events like the downpours in the Midwest in 2019, if you all remember that, prevented farmers in the US from planting 20 million acres due to flooding. So years of unconstrained economic growth and the burning of fossil fuels in service of that growth has not just caught up to us, it's actually eclipsed us. We need to take quick action. And climate change and pollution are reinforcing the inequities coming out of past economic growth. Communities of color are far more likely to be downwind from air pollution and downstream from hazardous waste flows. In the US, Black people are 3 times as likely to die from air pollution than the overall population. And the percentage of Black children who suffer from asthma in the US is twice that of white children. So the consequences of globalization, inequality, and climate change have also resulted in conflict and a reactionary anti-globalization movement. Changes to crop production and not having enough to eat are a key driver of world conflict. By 2050, unmitigated climate change has the potential to push more than 140 million people, or almost 3% of the population, from their homes, exacerbating an already growing migration crisis. And people in communities that have not taken part in the economic benefits of prior waves of globalization are calling for more protectionist policies and a retreat from the global economy. So we've seen this, of course, with Brexit in the UK's decision to leave the European Union. We're also seeing increased racism and blaming of people from different backgrounds, rather than an acknowledgement of the systemic and policy flaws that have made past waves of globalization inequitable. So that was a lot. And on top of all that, we've just wrapped up a year of a global pandemic, which has disrupted industries, halted economic growth and travel. So the question is, coming out of COVID-19, what's next for globalization? Is globalization even going to continue? And there's really 2 differing views. Some have said COVID's going to be the end of globalization. There's a 30 to 40% reduction in foreign direct investment, a 44 to 80% drop in international business travel, and COVID is reinforcing isolationist tendencies and protectionist policies. With the distribution of PPE and vaccines, we've seen that regional coordination isn't as smooth as we maybe once would have hoped. And an economist, Michael O'Sullivan, said that post-COVID, there's going to be a new world order that will be based not on globalization and open economies, but will be based on unification within and conflict across clusters of countries with shared values and approaches to economics. So those conflicting poles would be the Americas, the EU, and a China-centric Asia. So pretty dire outlook. But on the other hand, during COVID, we haven't really seen a collapse of market integration. International supply chain structures have generally remained the same. The US, for example, is still sourcing many consumer goods from China. And there's actually some evidence that more globalized countries have been more resilient during COVID. And COVID has resulted in this widespread adoption of new technologies and more remote work. And this could actually deepen global integration through more offshoring of jobs and more global e-commerce and expanded markets for local products. So in reality, we're probably going to see both globalization and anti-globalization pressures together in the coming years. I believe that continued globalization in the sense of greater interconnectedness is inevitable so long as we continue to have the rapid technology advances we've seen in the past couple decades. The existence of COVID, the sharing of knowledge to manage the pandemic and develop the vaccine in itself exemplifies both the challenges and the benefits of globalization. The fallout from the pandemic, unemployment, food security has put the inequities caused by prior waves of globalization at the forefront. So, I wonder if in fact the pandemic may be just the moment we need to really reimagine systems and ensure globalization can advance in a more equitable and sustainable way. So if globalization is inevitable, the question becomes, how can we make the future of globalization more equitable and sustainable? How can we make sure people today benefit while not reducing the possibility of future generations benefiting? Overall, while free flows of markets and ideas will continue to contribute to more interconnectedness, I think more planning and regulation will be required at the international, national, and regional level to ensure future waves of globalization are more equitable and sustainable, including people in communities who have been left behind by prior waves of globalization in developing solutions will also be necessary to ensure success and equitable outcomes. Among the solutions, the most critical is to curb climate change. The challenges of globalization will be compounded if resources that could be put towards strengthening local economies have to be diverted to mitigate climate change. Extreme weather disasters resulting from climate change cost the global economy $2.5 trillion in the last decade. And that was an increase of almost $1 trillion compared to the decade before. So more extreme weather events will intensify the challenges of global instability, hunger, poverty, and conflict. And climate change could render some places uninhabitable. And all countries, regardless of location or wealth, will suffer economic losses from climate change. So we just can't grow using the fossil fuel intensive processes of the past. And you may be thinking, well, with the pause on travel from COVID, that's really given the Earth some time to heal. According to the International Energy Agency, COVID-related restrictions have resulted in a 6% drop in carbon dioxide emissions over the last year. However, it's looking like as the economy reopens, we're on track to exceed prior year levels. So for example, emissions in December 2020 were 2% higher than emissions in December 2019 globally. So we still don't have the infrastructure we need to reopen in a sustainable way. Tackling climate change will require more planning and regulation at all levels of government, continued global cooperation, and changing consumer preferences. And there are, of course, bright spots. The cost of renewable energy sources continues to become more favorable compared to fossil fuels. More and more car companies are pledging to go away from fossil fuels. And there's a growth in regenerative agriculture, really a return to Native American agricultural practices to make agricultural production less carbon intensive. However, we need to accelerate those bright spots in the pace of change. Climate change continues to be our most pressing issue, and failure to mitigate climate change and adapt to our already changing climates has the potential to make any other economic development effort really an insurmountable challenge. So beyond mitigating climate change, here's a couple ideas of things we could do to advance equitable outcomes and ensure everyone benefits from continued economic growth. First, we need to acknowledge inequities and invest in people in a targeted way. Prior to COVID, some of the countries that benefited from economic growth during globalization and had more equitable outcomes for their populations invested in social programs to ensure access to healthcare and education, among other benefits for all. The Netherlands and Sweden are a couple examples here. With COVID, social safety net programs have become more widespread in other countries. In the United States, we usually put a limit on or a number of conditions on benefit programs, but during COVID, we've rapidly expanded them and they're receiving increasing support. The long lines of cars at food banks during COVID showed us how precariously close millions of hardworking Americans were to food insecurity. And so our COVID response really seems like an opening to consider how more public benefit programs could help to address systemic barriers to financial and food security and ensure the benefits of growth are more equitably distributed. SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, formerly known as food stamps, is one such benefit that's proven to increase financial and food security in the US. Coming out of our learnings as a country from COVID, it would be great to see expanded eligibility and benefit levels for SNAP. And for policies and programs like that to drive equitable growth, they need to be targeted as well. And what I mean by that is that we could have an improvement overall in an outcome like food security, and food security rates in the US could improve, but we may not see the gap in food security rates between white people and communities of color closing. We need policies that are universal, available to and applied to everyone in need, but also targeted at the needs of particular groups of people to reduce longstanding disparities. For example, expanding SNAP benefits is important to addressing food insecurity, but there are some remote rural communities that don't have local food retailers who accept SNAP. So we also need to take approaches that address awareness and access challenges so that everyone can use their benefits. Identifying policies like this that will help to level the playing field within countries and support those most vulnerable will be important to more equitable global growth. And those populations that have been historically marginalized should be involved in helping to develop those policy solutions. Another important solution for more equitable globalization is aggressively closing the skills gap. One important way of investing in people is building the skills of the future. This will ensure people can find employment and participate in that next wave of globalization. By 2022, it's estimated that at least 54% of employees globally will require or upskilling. That's next year, by the way. With COVID, some employment opportunities may not come back or may come back as completely different from before. So this need for new skills will only be exacerbated coming out of COVID. And there's economic benefits to reskilling, upskilling too. According to the World Economic Forum, closing the global skills gap could add $11.5 trillion to global GDP by 2028. So we need to reskill and upskill people, not just for the next 5 years, but also provide students with the skills they need to adapt to the jobs that will be necessary in the next 20, jobs we can't even imagine right now. South Korea successfully shifted from an industrial to a service-oriented economy over the last 15 years through significant investments in higher education. Schools today are increasingly introducing design thinking and technology at all levels of education, such as New Zealand's technology curriculum for all students. And training around green jobs here is also an opportunity. Solar energy jobs in the US have grown at 5 times the rate of the economy, and investments in renewables create 3 times more jobs on average. So, gotta aggressively close the skills gap. And also for more equitable and sustainable globalization, we also need to invest in local innovation and regional economic development. I shared at the beginning that not only have people been left behind, but entire regions within countries have been left behind in past waves of globalization. Those past waves were characterized by top-down policies that tended to focus on providing infrastructure to attract industries and foreign direct investment, or over-relied on developing just one industry and not diversifying enough. So there's no one solution that's going to work for every region. And I think a big risk for future globalization is that we replicate and apply cookie cutter solutions to economic development. We need to transition to more place-based and bottoms-up approaches that identify and accelerate local innovations, creating systems where local ideas can emerge and adapt, and then leverage the interconnectedness of globalization to share and enhance those locally developed solutions. The COVID vaccine distribution process has actually provided some interesting examples of this in practice. The state of West Virginia, as I'm sure many of you have heard, has one of the highest vaccination rates in the world right now. And they achieved this by developing locally tailored solutions, recognizing that 30% of the state's population lacks access to broadband internet. They didn't replicate the online registry being set up in other states and instead set up a phone hotline that worked well, particularly for the elderly folks they were targeting with the vaccine. Instead of working with the national pharmacy chains that were partnering with the federal government, the state chose to work with independent drugstores who had relationships with locals. And of course, it still took a global network to develop the vaccine, and the federal government still played an important role in ensuring the supply of vaccine to West Virginia. So this isn't a story of regions going at it alone, but it's a story of how global solutions and interconnectedness can coexist with that regional innovation and place-based approaches. We're also seeing some promising regional solutions in the food system. COVID has exposed the vulnerability of global supply chains, as anyone who during this pandemic has seen an empty shelf at the grocery store knows well. And COVID really has completely disrupted our operating model at Feeding America and made things very challenging for our network of food banks. So there's been a lot of rapid innovation across food banks and partners to identify new sources of excess food locally, partnering with restaurant kitchens or food service distributors with available capacity, and new distribution models to get that food in the hands of folks who need it, despite the public health challenges. So it's really exciting to see more of those local food system partnerships blossom through this, and I think there'll be continued opportunities to do so. Another example of local food system innovation is in Maine, where sadly the lobster supply has been threatened by growing acidity of oceans. Maine fishermen have actually started to grow and harvest kelp and sell it for processing to consumers. Typically, kelp and seaweed consumed in the US are imported from Asia. So this has created an entirely new industry in Maine. And by the way, kelp grows at a fast rate and helps to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So it's in turn helping to reduce the acidity of the ocean. So here's a locally grown, sustainable solution for economic development. And I'm really struck by the fact that it's that global connectedness and prior waves of globalization that has created consumer demand to grow something like kelp and seaweed in the US. So try kelp noodles in your ramen the next time you have a chance to order it. So some of the keys to success for regional development and supporting that local innovation are ensuring a mix of education, employment, and infrastructure to create and sustain jobs locally. You have to have a mix of education, job opportunities, and infrastructure. A lot of times regions go focus on one or the other. You have to mobilize local assets and resources that can compete in national and global markets, like Maine's fishing economy. And you also need inclusion, so local participation of many stakeholders in actually developing and co-developing those solutions. And you have to have incentives for entrepreneurs. Ideally, these solutions will be locally owned to create wealth within the community, as well as creating jobs. So I do believe it's possible to have more global growth and connectedness while still building resilient, distinct local economies that can all participate in that global growth. So I've shared that some of the solutions for more sustainable and equitable globalization are, first and foremost, mitigating climate change, investing in people and targeting those inequities, addressing the skills gap, and supporting local innovation to promote regional development. And you're probably wondering, that's all well and good if there's public and political will to take on those solutions in a given country or region. So then the next question becomes, how do we influence other places to participate in globalization in a more equitable and sustainable way? International organizations like the World Health Organization, the World Economic Forum will continue to play an important role in promoting collaboration across a wide array of global actors, and holding folks accountable. Evidence has shown more connected countries have had faster economic growth, so there is an incentive for countries to continue to want a seat at those tables. And even though COVID and Brexit have highlighted challenges, I think institutions for cross-country cooperation, like the European Union, will allow more localities and regions within countries to access the global economy and participate in the next wave of globalization. The African Union, for example, has played an important role in coordinating COVID response across Africa and securing vaccines. In Latin America, the lack of a organizing or coordinating institution like that has made vaccine distribution really challenging. And I know other talks in this series will cover or have covered those institutions in more depth as well. However, beyond those institutions for international collaboration, I think consumer and constituent pressure will play an even bigger role in driving adoption of more equitable policies and more sustainable processes. Continued advancements in technology will continue to build awareness and sharing of these issues globally, causing individuals to put pressure on their governments and the firms they purchase from. As an example, this summer, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd, a growing movement around Black Lives Matter in the United States, both online and offline, caused firms, global and local, to take quick action outlining their commitments and planned actions around racial justice. Catalyzed by events like the explosion of a garment factory in Bangladesh, consumers are increasingly demanding more supply chain transparency in the fashion industry, as well in the supply chains of other consumer goods. And I think we're seeing too that consumers are willing to pay higher prices for fewer quality sustainable products. That trend around fast fashion is waning. And individuals are increasingly reducing their individual food waste and limiting meat consumption to help contribute to a more climate-friendly food system. So I know we've covered a lot of heavy topics, and hopefully everyone is feeling a bit hopeful, but I hope there's a lot of work to be done, but I hope those last few points leave you with the realization that you as an individual, we all as individuals, have the power to make the next wave of globalization more equitable and sustainable. In our interconnected world, with more technology advances underway and more ways of connecting with people in all countries, individual actors can play an even more important role in shaping the next wave of globalization. So, in conclusion, we must acknowledge the inevitability of globalization and greater interconnectedness, and invest in policies at the national and local level to make it more equitable and sustainable. COVID-19 has been a major disruption. It has exposed the inequities that were left by preceding waves of globalization, but the crisis also presents opportunities to reimagine systems and industries for the future to be more sustainable and equitable. And we're guaranteed to have more disruptions: technology, demographic shifts, consequences of climate change, and likely more pandemics. So I hope this presentation has shared some ideas for how we can build a more equitable, sustainable world that is resilient to those future disruptions. And I'll pause here for questions, but also welcome your thoughts and ideas. Would love to hear from you in the comments. What impact do you think COVID will have on globalization and further global integration? And how do you think those impacts will play out in Western Michigan? And then also, what other ideas, things I might have missed, that you think could help to make the future of globalization more equitable and sustainable in a post-COVID world? And what other actions can we take as individuals? I'll end there.
Julia, thank you so much. Wow, I've got notes scribbled over all kinds of pieces of paper and ran out of room. So you gave us much to think about, and very creative thinking. Thank you very much for that. And our viewers, our listeners are catching the same drift. The first one that we've got in there is about International Women's Day. We opened up by noting that special day, and somebody's asking a question about how does gender figure into the equation of achieving a more equitable globalization?
Yeah, great question. So as I mentioned, I think globalization has helped to improve the standing of women generally improved awareness of women's rights issues, equality, but we're still not where we need to be. And all those themes of disparities still persistent in the so-called winners of globalization are true of women as well. So in the US, there's still a disparity in pay between women and men, still a disparity in leadership at our biggest companies. So we still have a lot more work to do there. And clearly our education, hiring systems, and the industries that we've developed in past waves of globalization haven't sufficiently closed that gap. So there's still more work to do. And when we think about building on the assets and strengths of localities and regions, a lot of times around the world, women are the best local entrepreneurs. So any ways we can find to identify women doing great work locally to help build their communities and supporting them, I think is great.
Thank you for that. Here's a comment from a listener who's on the same track with you. Some of the solutions that you gave references the documentary Kiss the Ground, which just came out in 2020, it looks like. It says activists, scientists, farmers, and politicians turn to regenerative agriculture to save the planet's topsoil. That is the idea, with the irrepressible Woody Harrelson as the host, I guess. How do you know? But that just came out. So listener was saying, wondering about communities considering composting as a service. Also referenced seaweed mixed with silage for cattle reduces methane gas impact. And you were talking about the Maine fishermen generating kelp and using that. So it seems like there's a lot going on around regenerative soil, around new products that are going to help limit climate change.
Yeah, I added that to my list. I haven't seen that film. And it's interesting because, right, a lot of movement around new forms of agriculture, but when it comes to things like composting and eating kelp, it reminds me, so a big part of the shift that we need to make in food systems and more broadly for more equitable and sustainable globalization is going to involve changes to consumer preferences. So eating new foods that we maybe haven't eaten at a bigger scale than we've maybe eaten them in the past. Composting, adding, right, in our world of convenience, adding an additional step we have to do. So how can we kind of nudge consumers and make those individual changes easier? I was also hearing about how in so many places, including here, I'm physically in Chicago right now, and we have this invasive species, Asian carp. So I was hearing about how with so many invasive species around the US, how could more restaurants actually serve them? So as we catch these invasive species, rather than going to waste, actually also adding them to the food system.
Yeah, related question. Somebody interested in hearing more about food systems that are less carbon intensive. I think you did talk about some of those, but
yeah,
are there others?
Yeah, so I think kind of broadly the issue is our food system sort of evolved in the US, evolved in this phase of kind of hyper efficiency and production. So a lot of systems that predated World War II, for example, were based on rotating crops, growing livestock on the same fields where you would be growing crops. So manure from the livestock would naturally fertilize the soil. And as we've grown to be more efficient in our food systems, a lot of those natural methods of fertilization and rotating soil were replaced with intensive use of fertilizer. So the regenerative agriculture practices mentioned by the film that the other viewer recommended are really kind of about returning to those more natural, less carbon intensive ways of food production. But of course, I think those processes only go so far. It's also just about our consumption patterns. When you go to the grocery store, we expect to see in the produce section just that whole table full of apples. It looks beautiful, but if you're at the grocery store at 8 p.m., you have to wonder where all those apples going at the end of the day. And thanks to our wonderful partners, a lot of those are going to food banks. But the reason grocery stores do that is that we as consumers kind of are used to and want to see that abundance. So we're really perhaps overproducing for food than there is demand from consumers.
Question from a listener: how do we predict the needs of future jobs?
Great question. So, and it's something I wonder about a lot when we think about increased automation. Will that result in more jobs for a transition to more service type economy, more jobs giving people experience and services, or will that kind of result in net fewer jobs? And I think, I think we just have to imagine a sort of continuation of the trends we've seen where, a lot of roles that could readily be automated will continue to be more automated. But I also think we're starting to see that people, when you go to the grocery store and you do the self-checkout, a lot of times it's easier to just talk to someone, especially now during the pandemic. So, I think sometimes even the things we thought would follow that trend, it's possible will go back to sort of old ways of doing things. So I think it's really tough to predict, but, I think we need to think about not just equipping young people with the technical skills for the jobs of the future, but also ways of thinking. So that's why I always go back to design thinking. So how can folks have the creative thinking skills to sort of anticipate what skills they may need in the future, not be too locked into any particular skill set, so that as the world continues to change rapidly, they can pivot.
Julia, you were co-chair of the World Economic Forum's annual meeting. That must have been an amazing experience for you. And I'm wondering, what were you hearing from other countries? Is the United States an outlier in a lot of these areas in climate change recognition or in some other things? What were your colleagues from other countries telling you about their efforts?
Sure. Yeah, and of course we had a different presidential administration then, so there was a lot to be said from other countries during the Trump years. And I think it really struck me that the conversation was, the conversations other countries were having around climate change, around ways of measuring economic growth in new ways. So, that's actually not even something that we've covered yet, but pivoting from measuring success in terms of GDP to frameworks for measuring the well-being of a population. So how neat would it be if when we were comparing countries, instead of comparing GDP, we were comparing the well-being and happiness of citizens. So conversations were happening like that with participants from all around the world. These conversations about more equitable policies, how to remove barriers to healthcare and education, prepare for the skills of the future. And so I think it just struck me that the US, with some of the basic issues we were grappling with, wasn't really a leader in some of those conversations. So I think that was sort of my observation. And I think, hopefully now coming out of COVID, the learning and innovation we've seen will be more poised to be, the lead in some of those conversations around equity, thinking about measuring success in new ways. And it was a really neat experience. I was sort of randomly sitting next to Al Gore at one point, so got to talk about climate change.
You did touch on this a little bit, but a listener wanted some more comments about climate-induced migration and the resulting conflicts that that has caused and may continue to cause in the future.
Yeah. So I think if the sort of root cause of a lot of conflicts in the Middle East, for example, evidence shows it's hunger. So whether it's conflict decimating sources of agricultural production, rising temperatures, making it more difficult to raise crops. A lot of refugees have said that they're leaving because they don't have reliable access to food, among other issues like violence, of course. But there have been some studies that are suggesting that future migration patterns will be driven by growing food insecurity as a result of some places becoming uninhabitable or not places where we can't have the same level of crop production. And it's just scary to think about, as that happens, those continued tensions as migrants and places in the host country come together, and just sort of seeing that as the issue rather than seeing those broader systemic issues and our inability to address climate change as the root cause. Obviously there's a lot of complex factors that go into migration and geopolitics, but just so often food is, becomes a core issue. In the US, food security rates are so terrible because it's a really elastic thing. When you have trouble covering your education expenses, your healthcare expenses, you turn to the charitable food system and other ways to get food. So as soon as we can, provide more opportunities to more folks, those rates of food security will improve. So the folks.
Thanks. Yeah. Another question. When you speak of the need to provide more assistance, what do you say about, is it cash assistance versus assistance in kind? And that's both a domestic and international question.
Yeah. So I think, there's a lot of different models that have had varying success, different places. I think some places it's not cash assistance and it's just, a healthcare system where everyone has access to healthcare, access to education. I think a lot of places have been successful with, having more competitive education systems, a mix of private and public. I think cash assistance is really interesting. It's not something I've looked at it as much, but it allows folks to make choices about what they need for their family at a given point of time, rather than someone else making those choices for them. And I think, as I mentioned, it's interesting with COVID that in the U.S. that's not. I think cash assistance isn't something we've explored seriously. And when Andrew Yang came out with that proposal, it was, but with COVID, we've really given a large number of people who were unemployed a substantial cash benefit and really trusted them to make choices about what they needed and what their families needed to get through the pandemic right now. So, I think it'll be really interesting to do more research on that and see how it could inform future policy.
Mm-hmm. Interesting question from a listener. Will a year of work from home reverse the recent trend to urban living? It seems that many young people and couples might be looking for 4 and 5 bedroom houses so both people can have home offices. This could also drive people back to the suburbs, getting them out of the urban environment and affect the carbon footprint. So this whole work from home revolution that COVID has produced, what's some of the conversation around what's going to stick, how that's going to affect all the things we've been talking about?
Yeah, I think this is really interesting because in the field of regional or local economic development, there's a lot of questions about why do we continue to have economic activity concentrated in places like urban areas where there's higher rent? Like, what is keeping people in urban areas when in a flat world, folks could be dispersed everywhere? And so pre-COVID, there was a lot of research that this is an actual academic term, local buzz, that local buzz of being in an urban area contributed to economic development. So whether it was meeting people in person for meetings or just those casual happenstances in urban areas, that was part of what kept all that economic activity concentrated. And so now with COVID, where we have this new adoption of remote working, I do think there are, I know for a fact there's people who are leaving cities and moving to more remote areas. I personally think, maybe families will move to more remote areas. I personally think there's going to continue to be, once we get out of COVID, concentration of economic activity in urban areas, maybe not to the point of sort of the bubbles and high rents in the Bay Area, for example, but I do think we'll see continued concentration. I just think once folks get back to the ways of working before, in some instances, those in-person interactions will be preferred. But it's a really interesting question and something I'll be watching closely. And I think we all want the answers before we decide where to live next.
Now, this relates to a question we just talked about a little bit. Listener saying that there was a headline about a California city that did give people $500 a month. And apparently the results were that more people found jobs and there was less depression after getting that assistance. You're aware of that instance? And does that sound logical?
Yeah, I guess that those results wouldn't surprise me. You know, and I think it's that's interesting. I'll look more into that. And I assume that was prior to COVID. I think it's also interesting to think about, you know, in our education system, there's so much student debt. And so when students leave school, they don't have necessarily the same opportunities open to them. So some students may pursue careers that will allow them to pay off that debt. Others maybe without debt have a wider range of options available to them. So when we think about cash transfers, I also think it's interesting to think about it as a way to like free up more options for students when they leave university. So in addition to making education more accessible, how might that incentivize more students to pursue careers in the public sector or be entrepreneurs and take a risk in their first couple years out of college to start new businesses? So, you know, I think they certainly have potential, and interesting to think about sort of who and when might get those cash transfers.
More a global question again. Which nation, in your opinion, is the leader of the globalization movement? People who are getting this right, are thinking about all these questions that you've talked about, you know, and what makes them a leader? What lessons might we in the world learn from what they're doing?
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, it's tough because they have a smaller population than Chicago, but New Zealand is really doing incredible work. I'm sure everyone has seen them in the news. And even before, you know, their great work controlling the COVID crisis, they were doing a lot of work to diversify their economy from farming and tourism to make sure it expanded into more areas. As I think I mentioned, they have a technology curriculum that's a core part of their education from first grade on. So doing a lot of work to prepare students for the future. And I believe they're also adopting a sort of well-being framework for measuring their progress as a country beyond GDP. So again, I know maybe easier to have all that type of progress when you're a smaller country, but I think a lot to be learned there that we could apply to larger countries as well.
Your work at the World Economic Forum looked at millennials as well. So here's a question about generational change. How is the next generation impacting how globalization gets pursued? Are there themes in what you're seeing from the millennials about what they want pursued and what they will champion as they take more and more control of, you know, institutions and nations and companies and the like?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it will, as we have that demographic shift, I think it will only accelerate, you know, that value we're putting on companies who put the needs of the planet and the needs of other stakeholders beyond just profit. I think millennials will continue to push for supply chain transparency and reward companies that are doing really innovative things in the sustainability space. And right, that's as consumers, but as we continue to have that demographic shift, millennials and, you know, the generation behind us too will be in leadership roles at those companies. So it won't only be driven by what consumers want, it'll be driven by what the folks working at these companies want to be working on and their values. And it will be driven by who's sitting on boards. So, you know, I'm optimistic that particularly this population, I'm a millennial that's grown up with climate change and just really sees this as this is our future, will really continue to drive towards this change. But it's tough too. In 20 years, maybe there will be a push towards, you know, away from progressive values. I don't know what could drive that, but we've certainly seen that in history before, where more progressive generations, as they've gotten older, have changed a bit. So we'll see. But I'm I'm optimistic that, we'll continue to have capitalist economies, but there's really a sea change in the constraints that consumers and managers are putting around those companies.
Are international organizations going to take a larger role in, like a Gates Foundation or some of these other kinds of global private international? It seems that countries are ceding the ground to some of these international companies, and they're driving some of the agendas rather than nation states. Is there a trend there that's continuing, you think, or what can we look for?
Absolutely. I think global companies and large nonprofits or foundations that have those resources will be driving that agenda as well. I think we've seen that with the with climate change. In the absence of major regulation or shifts on climate policy, a lot of companies still in the US pledged to reduce their use of fossil fuels. And I think that was a combination of the market forces heading that direction and kind of seeing that renewables will be more economical in the future, but also consumer demand, and also seeing that eventually governments may go that way as well. So I think we are at a really interesting moment where these global companies that really transcend borders, and these global organizations too do have the ability and resources to kind of set the agenda. And I think that just reinforces the importance of our collective actions as individual consumers and constituents in that new global order of these global companies as well. And we've seen that with the vaccine distribution as well. These the pharmaceutical firms that develop the vaccines are really global companies, and all the complexities of that and the way they've navigated with different nation states has been really interesting.
Interesting. Yeah. Somebody asking, what is the state of the food banks and the food insecurity right now in the United States? And with COVID, you mentioned the lines, and we've seen them on television. The lines in a stadium lining up for food distribution. Compared to pre-COVID, what's the state of food banks now in the country, and what needs to be done yet to support them?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. I mean, the spring kicked off an unprecedented demand on the food bank network, and it was both more people showing up for food, but also those challenges to food supply. So our largest sources of food donations were retail, and then the grocery shelves were empty. So really needing to quickly innovate and get food from more sources and from the government as well. And then a disruption to the operating model. So about 20% of the agencies or food pantries where folks would come to get food had to close. And so really quickly finding new ways to get food to people. And so I think, we're continuing to see sustained increases in demand. It's gotten better, I think, more through routinizing some of these innovations that have been put into place. And, we're expecting that demand to continue. After the 2008 economic recession, it took 10 years for food insecurity rates to recover and get back to what they were before 2008. So we risk food insecurity rates kind of staying at this elevated level for the next 10 years, unless we expand access to SNAP, make sure we're sourcing food to meet the demand, and do other policy interventions that'll help give folks some relief. So I'm really hopeful this won't be a 10-year journey, but I think, this is something where once everyone's vaccinated, this food security crisis isn't going to be over. It's going to take time for jobs and industries to come back or be reimagined, or folks to get the skills they need to take on new jobs. And there is greater awareness of hunger in the US now, and I'm grateful to be here today just to share that, again, despite being the wealthiest country in the world, even before COVID, we had this shocking problem where 1 in 6 children didn't necessarily know where their next meal was going to come from. So hoping to reiterate that this isn't just a COVID issue, but pre-COVID issue as well, and will continue.
Yeah. I'm not sure everybody understands what SNAP is. Can you break that apart, the acronym down, and talk about that a little?
Sure. Yes, so that's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, formerly known as food stamps. So that gives folks the ability to, they have their card and they can get food right at the grocery store. So it's really convenient. They can get the nutritious foods they want and need. And so SNAP, right, we provide charitable food, but we also make sure the people we serve who are eligible are applied for and getting enrolled in SNAP so that they can access that food as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. A question about China and the US and what that competition rather than cooperative stance means for the world. You mentioned the idea of a multipolar world based on different global values as a possibility for globalization. How does that impact the climate change and a lot of things? And you see the two systems, the Chinese system, the American Western system in conflict, more conflict than cooperation.
Right.
What does that mean for globalization?
Yeah, and I might be optimistic here, but sort of contrary to that multipolar world, I tend to believe we'll continue to have ultimately greater connectedness and convergence. China actually is moving quite a bit on the climate issue, right? Like the United States, it needs to happen at a faster pace, but we're we're not quite ones to talk yet. And so, and I think China is ultimately, we have a very integrated supply chain. And so I think those same actions of consumers the world over will impact China. I think it'll also be interesting to see as China's population continues to, become more middle class and, take advantage of these economic opportunities that have come out of globalization. I do think we'll have continued convergence and more interconnectedness, even though that relationship is fraught right now rather than two poles. Just thinking out loud, the only thing that I think could complicate that is, countries like China, there are limits on information coming in. So, I think in my talk, there was this whole thesis about our ability to communicate issues and actions the world over. So, when there's that potential information block of not being able to share ideas freely, that could maybe challenge my optimistic view. But I think we've seen more convergence than divergence really over the last 30 years.
You mentioned each of us as individuals, finding out what we can do about this, how we can get engaged in this. What common sense advice would you give to us? Are there things we can do politically? Are there things we can do action-wise locally? What 2 or 3 things might you suggest for our listeners to become engaged in this?
Sure. Well, first of all, if you are passionate about ending hunger in the US, really encourage you to get involved with your local food bank. In Grand Rapids, that's Feeding America, West Michigan. We are in dire need of volunteers right now. There's increase in demand, and a lot of our volunteer base, took a step back as the pandemic played out. So encourage you to plug in to your local food bank, find ways to volunteer, other ways to support. If you're not in Grand Rapids, there you can go to feedingamerica.org and find your local food bank. And I think that's on the food security issue. You can follow our work at Feeding America. We recently launched an equity fund, a food security equity fund that's going to drive investments to communities of color that we know have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. And then aside from food security, I think, this pressing climate change issue, really continuing to learn about that, talking to your friends, talking to your family, talking to your neighbors. We just scratched the surface of a couple of the impacts of climate change. I had the opportunity to go to something called the Climate Reality Training, which anyone can sign up for. They're offering virtual trainings. I learned a lot from it. So suggest checking something like that out, or another opportunity to go deeper on some of these climate issues. I think just the complexities of it, we're constantly learning more, and I got a lot out of it in terms of potential individual action. But I think the most powerful thing we can do is be advocates, be advocates to end hunger, be advocates to stop climate change, and then be advocates for these organizations and companies that are kind of doing right by us.
Interesting. Final question here is a little interesting, a little bit of flip on that. A question about any thoughts on whether the USA ought to be so dependent on NGOs like Feeding America versus changing governmental policy to address hunger more systematically? I guess in our politically charged days, you wonder whether that's a successful option. But what's your thought? Are there political solutions that we realistically can work for?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I mean, and I think part of the reason we have such a large nonprofit sector in the US is because our government has traditionally been pretty hands-off, or leaving more power to states. So I think some of these issues of inequities left by prior waves of globalization are places where the public sector has stepped in. So, I think if national and state governments did take more of that policy approach where they're identifying solutions, whether it's cash benefits or healthcare, education, things that would level the playing field and expand opportunities for more people, I do think there could be less of a role nonprofits would need to play domestically. But I think, the challenge in the US is the political will to sustain some of those policies. There may be something that's applied in some states, but not in other states. So it's complex, but I think the question is, hits at the heart of sort of why we operate in the way we do in the US as a system, with the government sort of playing a certain role and not necessarily historically tackling some of those root causes, and nonprofits working to fill that gap.
Julia, it's been a delight to spend this time with you. You've been a font of knowledge, a lot of very, very interesting things for us to consider. If people want to stay in touch with you, or what you're doing and thinking and writing, and with some of the issues that you described in your talk, what are some ways they can do that?
Great. Well, thank you for having me. This has been a lot of fun for me too, and a sort of nice break from my day-to-day work at Feeding America to think about some of these broader global issues and connections. Follow me on Twitter at Julia Luscombe. Would love to hear more from you about your ideas. And as you mentioned at the top, Michael, this is a space I'm really passionate about. And anything you're seeing in local food system innovation, that's something we want to incorporate in our work at Feeding America as well. So I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Great. And we look forward to crossing paths with you again. You're welcome in West Michigan anytime. So
I would love that. It is 60 degrees today in Chicago, so I hope you're getting similar weather.
We're close. We're close. So come in the summertime. Thank you, Julia, for being with us tonight. We've learned a lot. And if you'd like to continue our conversation on sustainable future, join us for the Global Mixer, which is this Wednesday at 7. You can register at worldmichigan.org/Great Decisions 2021. It's an informal time via Zoom. We'll reflect on Julia's presentation. We'll talk more generally about world events, and we'll have some on-the-spot polls and giveaways and a lot of fun. Our next speaker in the Great Decisions series is next Monday, March 15. We'll continue on a climate change conversation when Kare Siddiq Erickson and Bob Hollister, two environmental experts, will present on the melting Arctic. Tonight's program will be archived on YouTube. And when you're on YouTube, or you're on there right now, I'll end by saying, please like and subscribe to our channel before you sign off. Thank you again. May all everywhere in the world stay safe and well. Thanks again, Julia.